The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry wasps as Sarah Martinez stood in the corner of the mahogany-paneled boardroom, her maintenance uniform a stark contrast to the sea of tailored suits surrounding the conference table. Her calloused hands gripped the handle of her cleaning cart, knuckles white with tension, while CEO Jonathan Blackwell's voice cut through the air like a blade dipped in condescension. "I'm sorry, did the cleaning lady just interrupt our quarterly earnings discussion?" Blackwell's words dripped with practiced disdain as he leaned back in his leather chair, his Armani suit catching the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Seattle skyline. The other executives shifted uncomfortably, some stifling nervous chuckles, while others studied their phones with sudden intensity. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribcage, but her voice remained steady. "I wasn't interrupting, sir. I was simply pointing out that your projected savings from the healthcare cuts might be miscalculated. Based on the numbers you just presented, you're not accounting for the mandatory COBRA extensions or the increased turnover costs." The silence that followed was deafening. Blackwell's steel-gray eyes narrowed as he studied this woman who dared to speak mathematics in his temple of corporate power. At 42, he had built Meridian Industries into a Fortune 500 company through calculated ruthlessness and an unwavering belief in his own intellectual superiority. No one challenged him in his own boardroom, certainly not someone whose job description included emptying wastebaskets. "Excuse me?" His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Did you just attempt to correct my financial projections?" Sarah felt the weight of every eye in the room. The CFO, Margaret Chen, watched with barely concealed curiosity from behind her wire-rimmed glasses. The head of HR, David Kowalski, looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. The VP of Operations, James Morrison, simply stared with his mouth slightly agape. These were people who commanded seven-figure salaries, who held MBAs from prestigious universities, who spoke in acronyms and buzzwords that could make or break careers. And here was Sarah, 34 years old, high school dropout, single mother of two, standing her ground against their king. "Actually," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a warm knife through butter, "I have a master's degree in economics from the University of Washington and a PhD in applied mathematics from MIT. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to pause in reverence to the bomb she had just detonated in the center of their corporate universe. Blackwell's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. That's impossible. You're a janitor." "I'm a custodial engineer," Sarah corrected, with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And yes, I clean these offices 5 nights a week. I empty your trash, vacuum your carpets, and polish the conference table where you make decisions that affect thousands of lives. But during the day, I'm also a single mother raising 2 children, and at night, after they're asleep, I work here to pay for their future." She paused, letting her words sink in while studying the faces around the room. Margaret Chen had set down her pen entirely, her dark eyes wide with something that looked like admiration. David from HR was scribbling notes frantically, probably calculating the legal implications of what was unfolding. James Morrison had leaned forward in his chair, his expression unreadable. "But you're right about one thing, Mr. Blackwell," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I do have minimal experience in your world. I've only been studying your company's financial patterns for 5 years, listening to your strategies, observing your decision-making processes, and watching the real-world consequences of your policies play out in the lives of the people you employ." Blackwell's face had progressed from red to purple. "This is absurd. Security should have vetted—" "Oh, they did. My background check was thorough. PhD from MIT, summa cum laude. dissertation on predictive economic modeling in corporate restructuring, published researcher with 17 peer-reviewed articles in the Journal of Applied Economics. I'm sure it's all in my file, if anyone had bothered to look beyond the job I needed to take to survive. The truth hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for years, finally bursting into flame. Sarah thought of her children, Emma, age 9, and Marcus, age 12, sleeping peacefully in their small apartment 12 miles away. She thought of the scholarship applications she helped Emma fill out on weekends, of Marcus's science fair project on renewable energy that she had guided him through using principles she'd learned in graduate school. She thought of countless nights she'd fallen asleep over economic journals and mathematical proofs, keeping her mind sharp while her hands cleaned the offices of people who would never see her as anything more than part of the furniture. "You want to challenge my qualifications, Mr. Blackwell?" Sarah asked, her voice now carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose. "You want to debate the finer points of economic theory with the cleaning lady?" Blackwell straightened his tie with shaking hands, his corporate armor reasserting itself. "Fine. You want to play games? Let's play. But when I'm done with you, you'll be lucky to find work cleaning bathrooms at a gas station." "Is that a threat, sir?" "It's a promise." Sarah nodded slowly, her mind already calculating the risks and benefits of what she was about to propose. She thought of all the workers who would lose their health care, all the families who would struggle to pay medical bills, all the children who might not get the care they needed because a man in a suit wanted a bigger bonus. "Then let's make this interesting. A formal debate, your financial projections versus mine, your Harvard MBA versus my MIT PhD. The winner takes all." "And what exactly are the stakes?" Blackwell asked, his voice dripping with anticipated victory. Sarah smiled, and this time it did reach her eyes. "If I win, you implement my alternative proposal, one that saves the company money while preserving employee benefits. If you win—" She paused, meeting his gaze directly. "I'll resign and publicly apologize for overstepping my boundaries." The room buzzed with whispered conversations as executives processed what they had just witnessed. Margaret Chen was now openly smiling, while David from HR looked like he was having a panic attack. James Morrison pulled out his phone and began typing furiously. "Deal," Blackwell said, extending his hand with the confidence of a man who had never lost an argument in his life. "1 week from today, same time, same place, and I want the entire executive team here to witness your humiliation." Sarah shook his hand, her calloused palm meeting his manicured fingers. "1 week," she agreed. "And Mr. Blackwell? You might want to use that time to brush up on your advanced calculus. You're going to need it." As she wheeled her cart toward the door, Sarah heard Margaret Chen's voice cut through the stunned silence. This should be interesting. The cleaning woman, the PhD economist, the MIT graduate, the single mother who had been invisible for 5 years, walked out of that boardroom with her head held high. Behind her, she left a room full of executives who would spend the next 7 days questioning everything they thought they knew about intelligence, education, and the dangerous assumption that a person's worth could be measured by their job title. In exactly 1 week, Sarah Martinez would return to this room, but she wouldn't be coming to clean. She would be coming to teach. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced the pre-dawn darkness at 4:30 a.m., but Sarah Martinez was already awake, staring at the water stain on her bedroom ceiling that looked remarkably like the economic growth models she used to sketch on whiteboards at MIT. Her small apartment in the Beacon Hill neighborhood held the quiet stillness that only exists in the hours before the world awakens, broken only by the distant rumble of early commuter trains and the gentle breathing of her children in the next room. Sarah's morning routine had been refined over 5 years into a precise choreography of efficiency. Coffee first, strong and black, brewed in a machine she'd bought secondhand from a thrift store that still worked better than the expensive espresso maker gathering dust in the Meridian Industries break room. While the coffee percolated, she'd review her children's schedules, checking homework folders and permission slips with the same methodical attention she once applied to peer-reviewing economic research. Emma's math homework lay spread across the small kitchen table. Long division problems worked out in her careful 9-year-old handwriting. Sarah smiled as she reviewed each problem, noting her daughter's intuitive grasp of numerical relationships. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, she thought, remembering how she used to solve calculus problems on napkins during her own childhood, much to her mother's bewilderment. "Mom?" Emma's sleepy voice drifted from the doorway. "You're up early again." Sarah turned from the coffee maker to find her daughter rubbing her eyes, dark hair sticking up at impossible angles. Emma had inherited her mother's curious eyes and stubborn chin, along with an uncanny ability to sense when something was different in their carefully ordered world. "Is it about work?" Emma asked, her voice muffled against Sarah's shoulder. Sarah hesitated. How do you explain to a 9-year-old that her mother had just challenged one of Seattle's most powerful CEOs to an intellectual duel? How do you describe the moment when 5 years of swallowed pride and suppressed brilliance finally exploded in a boardroom full of people who measured worth by salary figures? "Something like that," Sarah said finally. "I might have to work a little differently next week." Emma pulled back to study her mother's face with the penetrating gaze that seemed far too mature for her years. "Are you in trouble?" "I don't know yet, sweetheart, but whatever happens, we'll handle it together. We always do." The reassurance seemed to satisfy Emma, who padded back toward her room to get ready for school. Sarah watched her go, marveling at the resilience children possessed when their foundation felt secure. Emma and Marcus had never known their father. He had disappeared before Emma was born, leaving behind only a forwarding address that led to a vacant apartment in Portland. But they had never seemed to feel deprived. Their world was small but stable, filled with bedtime stories about mathematical theorems and weekend adventures to the Museum of Flight, where Sarah would explain the physics of aerodynamics while other parents read information placards. By 6:15 a.m., Sarah had both children fed, dressed, and ready for their respective schools. The drive to Emma's elementary school took them through the changing neighborhoods of Seattle, from their modest apartment building past the gentrifying blocks where coffee shops with names like Grind Theory charged $6 for lattes. Emma chatted about her friend Sophie's birthday party and whether they can afford the American Girl doll on her Christmas list, while Marcus sat in the front seat working through algebra problems in a workbook 3 grades above his level. "Mom, can you help me with this one?" Marcus asked, holding up a problem involving quadratic equations. Sarah glanced at the page while stopped at a red light. "What do you think the first step should be?" "Factor out the common terms." "Good. And then?" "Use the quadratic formula." Or... Marcus studied the equation more carefully. "Oh, it's a perfect square trinomial. I can factor it directly." "Exactly. Sometimes the elegant solution is hiding right in front of us." After dropping both children at their schools, Sarah had 3 hours before her shift at the university library, where she worked part-time cataloging research materials and helping graduate students navigate databases she had once contributed to as a researcher. The irony wasn't lost on her. She now filed away studies conducted by economists who earned in 1 year what she made in 5, while her own dissertation gathered digital dust in MIT's archives. The University of Washington campus held a bittersweet familiarity as Sarah walked across the quad toward the library. She had once presented her research in these same halls, had attended conferences where her name appeared on programs alongside Nobel laureates and MacArthur Fellows. Her dissertation advisor, Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, still sent Christmas cards and occasional emails asking why Sarah had never pursued an academic career. How do you explain that academia's publish or perish culture doesn't account for prenatal complications that drain your savings? How do you describe choosing between conference presentations and prenatal care, between research fellowships and health insurance for your children? How do you admit that the life of the mind is a luxury you can't afford when you're responsible for two small lives that depend on your ability to pay rent and buy groceries? Sarah, there you are. Dr. Michael Chen, the library's head of research services, approached with his usual armload of journals and that slightly frazzled expression that seemed permanently etched on his face. I was hoping you could take a look at this manuscript that came in yesterday. The author's methodology seems questionable, but I can't put my finger on exactly what's wrong. Sarah accepted the thick stack of papers, noting the title, Predictive Models for Corporate Restructuring in Post-Recession Markets. Her pulse quickened as she scanned the abstract, recognizing immediately the flawed assumptions that undermined the entire study. "Give me 20 minutes," she said. "You're a lifesaver. I don't know what we'd do without you." If only he knew, Sarah thought. If Dr. Chen realized that his part-time catalog assistant held a PhD in the exact field of this manuscript, would he offer her a research position? Would he recommend her for faculty openings? Or would he assume, like so many others, that her current circumstances somehow invalidated her credentials? Sarah settled into her corner desk, surrounded by towers of academic journals and the quiet hum of scholarly pursuit. This was her sanctuary, the place where her mind could stretch and flex muscles that had grown stiff from disuse. She read through the manuscript with the same intensity she once brought to her own research, making notes in margins and identifying the statistical errors that had escaped the author's notice. The paper's central flaw was elegant in its simplicity. The author had confused correlation with causation in his analysis of workforce reductions and productivity gains. Sarah smiled as she crafted her critique, remembering how Dr. Hartwell had drilled this distinction into her graduate students. Just because two variables dance together doesn't mean one is leading, she used to say. As Sarah worked, her mind wandered to the challenge she had accepted 12 hours earlier. Jonathan Blackwell would undoubtedly spend the week marshaling his resources, teams of analysts, consultants with impressive credentials, perhaps even outside experts to validate his projections. He would approach this debate like a military campaign, overwhelming her with data and intimidation. But Sarah had advantages he couldn't comprehend. She had spent 5 years studying his company from the inside, watching how theoretical models played out in the real world of break rooms and parking lots. She had seen how healthcare cuts affected productivity when employees worried about their sick children. She had observed how morale plummeted when workers felt devalued and expendable. She had witnessed the hidden costs that never appeared on quarterly reports, the turnover, the training expenses, the loss of institutional knowledge when experienced employees left for companies that treated them as humans rather than line items. "This is brilliant work," Dr. Chen said, reviewing her critique an hour later. "You've identified issues that the peer reviewers completely missed. Have you considered submitting this analysis for publication yourself?" Sarah looked up from her computer screen, where she was researching advanced economic modeling techniques for next week's debate with Blackwell. "I'm not sure I have the credentials for that kind of submission." Dr. Chen laughed. "Are you kidding? This level of analysis suggests graduate-level training at minimum. Where did you study economics?" The question hung in the air. Like a bridge, Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to cross. For 5 years, she had compartmentalized her life. The brilliant graduate student existed in the past. The struggling single mother lived in the present, and never did the two identities acknowledge each other. But Jonathan Blackwell had shattered those walls with his casual cruelty, forcing her to choose between continued invisibility and the risk of everything. "MIT," she said quietly. "I did my PhD work there about 10 years ago." Dr. Chen's coffee mug paused halfway to his lips. MIT? You have a PhD in economics and you're working part-time cataloging? Sarah, do you realize what opportunities you could— Life is complicated. Sometimes survival takes precedence over career advancement. The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's phone buzzing with a text from Marcus's school. Nothing urgent, just a reminder about the science fair next Friday, the same day as her debate with Blackwell. The timing seemed almost cosmic, as if the universe was testing her ability to balance the roles that defined her existence. That afternoon, as Sarah picked up her children from their after-school programs, she found herself studying their faces in the rearview mirror. Emma was explaining her art project to Marcus with animated gestures, while he listened with the patient attention of a big brother who genuinely cared about his sister's interests. They were good kids, kind, curious, resilient in the way children adapt to circumstances beyond their control. "Mom, Mrs. Patterson says there might be scouts from the gifted program at the science fair," Marcus said as they pulled into their apartment complex. "Do you think— would it be okay if I tried that?" Sarah felt her heart squeeze. The gifted program would mean opportunities for Marcus, advanced classes, better preparation for college, the kind of academic environment that could nurture his obvious talents. It would also mean longer school days, transportation complications, and expenses that would strain their already tight budget. "Of course, mijo, we'll make it work." "What if I don't get in?" "Then you'll keep working hard and try again." "But Marcus, I need you to understand something." Sarah turned in her seat to face both children. Intelligence isn't just about test scores or special programs. It's about curiosity, persistence, and using your gifts to help others. You're already intelligent in all the ways that matter. That evening, after homework was completed and dinner dishes were washed, Sarah sat at her small kitchen table with her laptop, surrounding herself with economic journals and legal pads covered with calculations. The debate was 6 days away, and she had a case to build that would save hundreds of jobs and thousands of lives. But first, she had to prove that a cleaning woman could outsmart a CEO. As she worked deep into the night, Sarah thought about the irony of her situation. 5 years ago, she was Dr. Sarah Martinez, rising star in the field of applied economics, her research cited by policymakers and fellow academics. Tonight, she was simply Sarah, single mother, part-time librarian, night shift custodian, using the same brilliant mind to fight for dignity in a boardroom that had never seen her as fully human. The transformation would be complete in 6 days. The question was whether the world was ready to see the woman who had been hiding behind the cart all along. Monday morning arrived with the kind of Seattle drizzle that seemed to seep into everything: clothes, buildings, souls. Sarah stood outside the imposing glass towers of Meridian Industries at 6 a.m., 45 minutes before her custodial shift began, studying the building with new eyes. For 5 years, she had entered through the service entrance, invisible among the army of maintenance workers who kept the corporate machine running. Today, she walked through the main lobby like a general surveying a battlefield. The security guard, Jerome Williams, looked up from his newspaper with surprise. "You're early today, Sarah. Is everything okay?" Jerome was one of the few people in the building who had ever bothered to learn her name. A former Army sergeant with kind eyes and a grandfatherly demeanor, he often shared photos of his grandchildren and asked about Marcus's science projects. In the ecosystem of corporate hierarchy, security guards and custodians occupied the same invisible stratum. "Just wanted to take a different look at things, Jerome. Can I ask you something?" "Shoot." "How long have you worked here?" 15 years come December. I started right after I retired from the service. Have you ever seen anyone challenge Blackwell before? In a meeting, I mean." Jerome set down his newspaper and studied Sarah's face carefully. "Heard something about some excitement in the boardroom Friday night. Word travels fast in a building like this." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "In 15 years, I've seen exactly 3 people stand up to that man. 2 of them were executives who got fired within the month. The third was a whistleblower who ended up in legal battles that lasted 3 years. What happened to the whistleblower? She won, eventually, but it cost her everything. Savings, marriage, health. Sometimes being right isn't enough. Sarah nodded, absorbing the warning disguised as conversation. Thanks for the heads up. Sarah... Jerome's voice stopped her at the elevator. For what it's worth, I've been watching that man destroy good people for 15 years. If someone's finally going to call him on it, I'm glad it's you. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor gave Sarah time to compose herself. The executive offices occupied the top 5 floors of the building, a rarefied atmosphere of mahogany and marble, where decisions affecting thousands of lives were made with clinical detachment. As a custodian, Sarah had access to every room, every conversation, every discarded document that might reveal the true cost of corporate ambition. Her first stop was Blackwell's office, a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of Elliott Bay. The office was a shrine to ego, walls lined with awards, photographs of Blackwell with politicians and celebrities, and a custom-built bookshelf filled with business books he'd probably never read. Sarah had cleaned this office hundreds of times, but today she noticed details that had escaped her attention before. Behind Blackwell's desk hung a diploma from Harvard Business School, prominently displayed like a medieval coat of arms. But it was the smaller frames that caught her attention now. Photographs from company retreats, charity galas, and board meetings. In every image, Blackwell stood at the center, surrounded by people whose faces reflected a mixture of deference and fear. Sarah began her usual cleaning routine, but her mind was calculating, analyzing, preparing. She emptied the wastebasket, noting the discarded drafts of memos about workforce optimization and operational efficiency, corporate euphemisms for firing people. She dusted the conference table where Blackwell held his inner circle meetings, remembering conversations she overheard about quarterly projections and shareholder expectations. The work felt different now. Each task carried weight, purpose, intention. She wasn't just cleaning, she was gathering intelligence for a war that would determine the fate of 300 families. By Tuesday, word of the upcoming debate had spread through the building like wildfire. Sarah noticed the change immediately in how people looked at her, or more accurately, how they finally started looking at her at all. Executives who had never acknowledged her existence suddenly found reasons to linger in hallways which she passed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when she entered rooms. The invisible woman had become visible, and the attention felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Margaret Chan approached Sarah during her afternoon library shift, her expression a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been respect. "I've been thinking about Friday night, those numbers you cited, the COBRA calculations, the turnover costs. How did you know them off the top of your head?" She continued cataloging journal articles, her hands steady despite the acceleration of her pulse. "I've been listening to these meetings for 5 years. Numbers tend to stick in my mind." "That's not just memory, that's analysis. You were doing real-time calculations of variables that our finance team spent weeks modeling." She paused, studying Sarah's face. "Who are you really?"
The question hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Sarah set down her pen and met Margaret's gaze directly. "I'm exactly who I appear to be, a single mother who cleans offices at night and works in the library during the day. The fact that I also happen to have advanced degrees doesn't change those basic facts." "Advanced degrees in what?" "Economics, applied mathematics." Margaret leaned back in her chair, processing this information. "From where?" "MIT." "Jesus Christ!" Margaret's professional composure cracked slightly. "You have a PhD from MIT, and you're working as a custodian?" "Life doesn't always follow the trajectory we plan, especially when you're responsible for children." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her analytical mind clearly working through implications and possibilities. "Sarah, do you realize what you're walking into? Blackwell isn't just arrogant, he's vindictive. If you embarrass him publicly, he'll use every resource at his disposal to destroy you. Then I better make sure I don't embarrass him. I'll make sure I demolish him completely." The confidence in Sarah's voice seemed to surprise them both. Margaret studied her with the sharp attention of someone reassessing a situation she had badly miscalculated. "You're serious about this?" "Dead serious. What do you need?" The offer hung in the air between them, an executive offering to help a custodian take down their mutual boss. Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest, the recognition that she wasn't as alone as she had believed. Access to the real numbers, not the sanitized versions Blackwell presents to the board, but the actual data on productivity, turnover, healthcare costs, and employee satisfaction. Margaret nodded slowly. "I can get you those. Anything else?" A fair fight. Wednesday brought the first direct retaliation. Sarah arrived at work to find her custodial supervisor, Rita Gonzalez, waiting with a clipboard and a stern expression. "Sarah, I need to talk to you about your performance review." Rita was a good woman caught in an impossible position. Middle management trying to balance corporate demands with genuine care for her team. Sarah had always liked her, appreciated her fairness, and the small kindnesses she showed to workers who were often treated as disposable. "What about it?" "There have been complaints about your work quality. Missed trash cans, inadequate dusting, unprofessional behavior during work hours." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "Rita, you know that's not true. My performance has been consistently rated excellent for 5 years." "I know." Rita's voice was barely above a whisper. "But the complaints are coming from high up, very high up, and they want documentation to support termination." "For challenging Blackwell?"
I can't say that officially. But Sarah, you need to be very careful. They're building a case against you, and they have resources you can't compete with. That evening, as Sarah helped Emma with her homework and listened to Marcus practice his science fair presentation, she felt the weight of her decisions settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She had challenged a system designed to crush people like her, and that system was beginning to respond with predictable ruthlessness. But when Emma looked up from her math problems and said, "Mom, why do some people think they're better than other people just because they have more money?" Sarah knew she couldn't back down. "I don't know, Mija, but I think it's important to show them they're wrong." Thursday's revelation came in the form of a leaked email that appeared in Sarah's personal inbox from an anonymous account. The subject line read simply, "You should see this." The email chain revealed the full extent of Blackwell's preparation for their debate. He had hired a team of consultants from McKinsey & Company, brought in economists from the University of Chicago, and scheduled practice sessions with debate coaches who had trained Fortune 500 CEOs. The budget for his preparation exceeded Sarah's annual salary. But more damaging was the tone of the emails, the casual cruelty with which Blackwell and his team discussed their strategy. The key is to overwhelm her with data she can't process in real time. Most people with fake credentials crack under pressure when confronted with genuine expertise. We should also consider the optics, a working-class woman challenging her betters. The board will appreciate seeing her put in her place. Once we've discredited her publicly, we can proceed with the layoffs as planned. This little disruption might actually work in our favor by demonstrating the consequences of challenging corporate authority. Sarah read the emails twice, her anger crystallizing into something cold and sharp and infinitely more dangerous than rage. They saw her as a performance, a cautionary tale to keep other employees in line. They had never considered the possibility that she might actually win. Friday morning, the day of the debate, dawned clear and bright, the kind of October day that made Seattle's reputation for rain seem like slander. Sarah woke before her alarm, her mind already sharp and focused. She had spent the week not just preparing arguments and memorizing data, but also remembering who she used to be,
Dr. Sarah Martinez, the graduate student who had presented her research to audiences of Nobel laureates without flinching. As she dressed, Sarah chose her clothes carefully, not the uniform of a custodian, but not the costume of a corporate executive either. Black slacks, white blouse, navy blazer. Professional but not pretentious, authoritative but not arrogant. She was dressing for the woman she had always been, not the role she had been forced to play. The children noticed the change immediately. "You look different, Mom," Sarah said over breakfast. "Like you're going somewhere important." "I am, sweetheart. I'm going to work just like always, but today feels different." Marcus looked up from his cereal, his 12-year-old intuition sensing undercurrents he couldn't quite identify. "Are you nervous?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "A little, but more than nervous, I'm ready." The science fair was scheduled for the same afternoon as her debate with Blackwell, a scheduling conflict that seemed designed to force her to choose between her roles as mother and professional. But Sarah had spent 5 years mastering the art of being in multiple places at once, of splitting her attention between competing demands without shortchanging either.
Marcus, I need you to know how proud I am of your project. Whether I'm there for the judging or not, you've done incredible work. You'll be there though, right? Sarah met her son's eyes, seeing in them the faith children place in their parents' ability to solve impossible problems. "I'll be there, I promise." As she dropped the children at school that morning, Sarah felt the familiar tug of divided loyalties that had defined her adult life. But for the first time in years, the pull felt different. Not the exhausting strain of compromising every choice, but the dynamic tension of someone finally strong enough to hold multiple truths simultaneously. She was a mother and a scholar, a custodian and a doctor, a woman who cleaned toilets and a woman who could rebuild economic models from first principles. The world had tried to make her choose between these identities, but today she would prove that she was large enough to contain them all. The debate was 6 hours away. Marcus's science fair was 7 hours away. And Sarah Martinez, all of her, every brilliant contradictory facet, was ready for both. The Meridian Industries boardroom had been transformed into an arena. Word of the debate had somehow leaked beyond the executive floors, and by 3 p.m., the space buzzed with an energy that felt more like a prize fight than a corporate meeting. Margaret Chen had arranged the seating to face each other, Blackwell at one end of the mahogany table with his team of advisors, charts, and laptops, while Sarah sat alone at the other end with nothing but a yellow legal pad and a calculator she had borrowed from the library. The audience filled every available chair and lined the walls. Executives who had never acknowledged Sarah's existence, middle managers who had watched her clean their offices for years, and a surprising number of support staff who had somehow found excuses to be in the vicinity. Jerome from security stood near the door, his expression unreadable, but his presence somehow reassuring. Rita, Sarah's supervisor, sat in the back row with a mixture of pride and terror written across her face. Jonathan Blackwell entered the room at exactly 3 p.m., flanked by his entourage like a boxer approaching the ring. He had chosen his most expensive suit, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his confident smile practiced to project absolute authority. Behind him trailed 3 consultants from McKinsey, 2 economists from the University of Chicago, and his personal assistant carrying a stack of binders thick enough to stop bullets. Sarah watched this procession with the calm attention of someone who had spent years studying predatory behavior in corporate ecosystems. She noticed how Blackwell's team positioned themselves, the consultants flanking him like bodyguards, the economists arranging their materials with theatrical precision, the assistant hovering nearby ready to provide any document or statistic that might be needed. This wasn't preparation, it was intimidation theater. "Well, well," Blackwell said, his voice carrying across the room with practiced projection. "I see our custodial engineer has decided to show up, though I notice she's traveling rather light." His gaze swept over Sarah's modest materials with obvious disdain. No team of advisors, no research assistants, no backup data? Sarah smiled, the expression warm and genuine, and somehow more unsettling than any aggressive posture could have been. I prefer to travel light, Mr. Blackwell. I find that when you really understand something, you don't need to hide behind other people's expertise. The first ripple of tension passed through the room. Margaret Chen, who had volunteered to moderate the debate, cleared her throat and stood at the head of the table. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today to examine two competing proposals for Meridian Industries' cost reduction strategy. Mr. Blackwell will present his plan first, followed by Ms. Martinez's alternative. Each presenter will have 30 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of cross-examination. Mr. Blackwell, you have the floor. Blackwell rose with the fluid confidence of a man who had delivered thousands of presentations to audiences worth billions of dollars. His opening was a masterpiece of corporate
theater, slides filled with colorful charts, statistics delivered with authoritative precision, and a narrative that painted Meridian Industries as a company fighting for survival in a hostile economic environment. "The facts are undeniable," he declared, gesturing toward a graph showing quarterly profit margins. "Healthcare costs have increased by 37% over the past 3 years, while productivity has remained essentially flat. Our competitors are streamlining their operations, and we must do the same or risk becoming irrelevant in an increasingly competitive marketplace." His presentation was polished, professional, and completely divorced from the human reality of what he was proposing. The numbers danced across the screen in neat rows and columns. 300 layoffs described as workforce optimization, healthcare cuts presented as benefits restructuring, pension reductions framed as retirement modernization. Each euphemism carefully crafted to distance the decision-makers from the consequences of their choices. "The savings are substantial and immediate," Blackwell continued, clicking a slide showing projected cost reductions. $18.7 million in the first year alone, with additional savings compounding annually. "This isn't just about improving our bottom line, it's about ensuring the long-term viability of this company and protecting the jobs of our remaining employees." Sarah watched the presentation with the detached attention of a scientist observing a laboratory experiment. She noticed how Blackwell's team nodded at predetermined moments, how his statistics glossed over critical variables, how his conclusions leapt across logical gaps that would have failed undergraduate review. This wasn't analysis, it was advocacy disguised as objectivity. When Blackwell concluded to polite applause from his supporters, Sarah rose from her chair with none of his theatrical flourish. She walked to the presentation screen, picked up a dry erase marker, and began writing equations in her neat handwriting. "Mr. Blackwell's presentation is impressive," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room without the forced projection of someone trying to command attention. "But it contains several fundamental errors in both methodology and mathematical modeling. Let me show you what I mean." She turned to face the room, the marker still in her hand, like a professor addressing a graduate seminar. "First, the healthcare cost increase that Mr. Blackwell cites, 37% over 3 years, sounds alarming until you adjust for medical inflation, which has averaged 11.3% annually during that same period. When you factor in normal medical cost escalation, our actual healthcare cost increase is only 2.1% above the national average." Sarah began writing numbers on the whiteboard, her calculations flowing with the fluid precision of someone who thought in mathematical languages. "Second, Mr. Blackwell's productivity measurements exclude several critical variables. He's measuring output per employee hour, but he's not accounting for quality metrics, customer satisfaction scores, or the hidden costs of stressed, overworked employees." The room had grown completely silent. Even Blackwell's consultants had stopped shuffling their papers to watch this woman perform complex calculations as easily as most people balance checkbooks.
But the most significant error, she continued, her voice gaining strength, is the assumption that workforce reductions will automatically translate to sustainable cost savings. Mr. Blackwell's model assumes that remaining employees will simply absorb the additional workload with no impact on productivity, quality, or retention. This assumption is not just optimistic, it's mathematically impossible. She turned back to the whiteboard and began sketching what looked like a complex system of interconnected equations. Employee productivity follows a predictable curve based on workload, stress factors, and job security. When you increase workload beyond optimal levels, which happens inevitably when you reduce workforce by 30%, productivity per employee actually decreases according to a logarithmic function.
Sarah paused, letting her words sink in while she added more variables to her growing equation. Furthermore, when employees perceive their job security as threatened, which happens when you eliminate their colleagues' positions, stress hormones like cortisol increase measurably, leading to decreased cognitive function, increased sick days, and higher turnover rates. One of the McKinsey consultants leaned forward, clearly preparing to challenge her assertions. Ms. Martinez, these are interesting theories, but do you have empirical data to support these claims? Sarah smiled. I'm glad you asked. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. I've been conducting an informal longitudinal study of this company for the past 5 years. Every conversation I've overheard while cleaning offices, every stressed employee I've encountered working late, every resignation letter I've emptied from wastebaskets, all of it has contributed to a data set that most consulting firms would pay millions to access. She opened the folder and began laying out charts and graphs hand-drawn with meticulous precision. When Meridian Industries reduced its customer service staff by 20% in 2022, customer satisfaction scores dropped by 15% within 6 months. When the accounting department eliminated 3 positions in 2023, the remaining staff's average overtime increased by 38%, leading to a 42% increase in turnover in that department alone. The room buzzed with whispered conversations as people leaned forward to examine Sarah's documentation. These weren't theoretical projections, they were real data from their own company, patterns that had been invisible to executives who never spoke directly to the workers experiencing the consequences of their decisions. But here's what makes Mr. Blackwell's proposal particularly problematic, Sarah continued, returning to the whiteboard. He's proposing these cuts simultaneously across multiple departments, which creates what systems theorists call a cascade failure. When you stress multiple interconnected systems at the same time, the negative effects don't add linearly, they multiply exponentially. She began drawing a diagram that looked like a spider web, with lines connecting different departments and functions. Reduce healthcare benefits and you increase employee stress. Eliminate positions and you increase workload on remaining staff. Combine these factors and you create a positive feedback loop where each problem amplifies the others. Blackwell had been growing increasingly agitated during Sarah's presentation, his confident smile fading into a tight grimace. This is all very theoretical, Ms. Martinez, but theory doesn't pay shareholders or keep this company competitive. We need practical solutions, not academic speculation. Sarah turned to face him directly, her expression calm but her eyes sharp with intelligence. You're absolutely right, Mr. Blackwell. Let me give you some practical solutions. She flipped to a new page on her legal pad and began outlining an alternative proposal. Instead of reducing healthcare benefits, we implement a wellness program that has been proven to reduce medical costs by an average of 22%. Instead of eliminating positions, we identify process inefficiencies that could save approximately $4.7 million annually without reducing workforce. Sarah's alternative unfolded like a masterclass in systems thinking. She had identified dozens of small improvements, automated processes that could eliminate redundant paperwork, cross-training programs that could increase efficiency without increasing workload, energy conservation measures that could reduce operational costs, vendor negotiations that could lower supply expenses without affecting quality.
The total savings from these measures, she concluded, writing the final number on the whiteboard, would be approximately $16.2 million in the first year, only $2.5 million less than Mr. Blackwell's proposal, but without the cascade effects that would ultimately cost far more than they save. The silence that followed was profound. Even Blackwell's consultants were scribbling notes, clearly impressed despite themselves by the comprehensive nature of Sarah's analysis. Margaret Chen broke the silence. "Miss Martinez, this is remarkably thorough. How long did it take you to develop this alternative?"
5 years, Sarah replied simply. I've been watching this company, learning its patterns, understanding its inefficiencies from a perspective that most executives never see. When you clean someone's office, you become invisible, and invisible people see everything. The cross-examination period that followed revealed the true extent of Blackwell's intellectual arrogance. He attacked Sarah's credentials, questioned her methodology, and attempted to overwhelm her with rapid-fire technical questions designed to expose gaps in her knowledge. But Sarah had spent 5 years preparing for this moment, even if she hadn't realized it at the time. Every economic journal she had read during lunch breaks, every late-night calculation session at her kitchen table, every careful observation of corporate behavior had been building toward this confrontation. When Blackwell challenged her understanding of modern portfolio theory, Sarah responded by deriving the mathematical proofs from first principles on the whiteboard. When he questioned her grasp of international trade implications, she cited studies published in journals she had contributed to as a graduate student. When he attempted to discredit her data collection methods, she explained the rigorous statistical techniques she had employed to ensure validity and reliability. The turning point came when Blackwell, growing desperate, made a fatal error in his own mathematical reasoning while trying to refute one of Sarah's calculations. Sarah caught the mistake immediately and corrected it with gentle precision, showing the room exactly where his logic had failed. "Mr. Blackwell?" she said, her voice still calm, but now carrying the quiet authority of someone who had seized complete intellectual control of the room. "You've confused nominal values with real values in your inflation calculations. When you adjust for purchasing power parity, your projected savings decrease by approximately 37%. The mistake was basic. First-year economics student basic, and everyone in the room with any financial training recognized it immediately. Blackwell's face flushed red as he realized what had happened. He had been intellectually outmaneuvered by a woman he had dismissed as intellectually inferior, and he had done it in front of the very people whose respect he needed to maintain his authority. As the formal debate concluded, Sarah glanced at her watch. 4:47 p.m. Marcus's science fair judging began at 5 p.m., and the school was 15 minutes away if traffic cooperated. She had kept her promise to herself. She had dismantled Blackwell's arguments completely and professionally. Now, she had to keep her promise to her son. "If you'll excuse me," she said, gathering her materials with practiced efficiency, "I have another important engagement this evening." As she walked toward the door, the room remained silent, executives and support staff alike still processing what they had witnessed. Sarah paused at the threshold and turned back to face Blackwell, who was slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon. "Mr. Blackwell, I want you to know that this was never personal. It was about the 300 families whose lives would be destroyed by your proposal, and the thousands more who would suffer the consequences of the cascade effects you refuse to acknowledge. Sometimes doing the right thing requires uncomfortable confrontations." She was halfway to the elevator when the applause began, tentative at first, then building to a thunderous ovation that echoed through the halls of Meridian Industries. Sarah didn't look back, but she smiled as the elevator doors closed behind her. She had a science fair to attend. The gymnasium at Roosevelt Elementary buzzed with the excited energy that only a school science fair could generate. Proud parents armed with smartphones, students bouncing nervously beside their projects, and the distinct aroma of baking soda volcanoes and homemade slime. Sarah arrived with 3 minutes to spare, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she navigated between displays of solar systems and plant growth experiments to find Marcus's corner of the gym. She spotted him immediately, standing beside his wind turbine model with the kind of focused intensity that reminded her so much of herself at that age. He wore his best button-down shirt and had attempted to tame his unruly hair with what appeared to be half a bottle of gel. When he saw her approaching, his face lit up with relief and something deeper. The quiet pride of a child whose parents had kept an impossible promise. "Mom, you made it!" Marcus's voice carried just enough surprise to break Sarah's heart a little. How many times had she disappointed him with late arrivals, missed events, or divided attention because survival required such brutal prioritization? "I told you I'd be here," she said, wrapping him in a hug that smelled like a nervous 12-year-old boy and industrial-strength hair gel. "Now, show me what you've built." Marcus launched into his presentation with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been practicing in front of his bedroom mirror for weeks. His project was elegant in its simplicity, a functional wind turbine constructed from recycled materials that demonstrated the mathematical relationships between wind speed, blade angle, and energy generation. But what impressed Sarah most was how he explained the underlying physics, his young mind grasping concepts that many adults found intimidating. "The optimal blade angle changes based on wind velocity," he explained, adjusting the turbine's position to demonstrate. "I calculated the theoretical maximum efficiency using the Betz limit, which says you can never capture more than 59.3% of the wind's kinetic energy." Sarah felt a familiar swell of maternal pride, mixed with something more complex. The recognition that her son possessed the same mathematical intuition that had once defined her own identity. Marcus didn't just understand the formulas, he understood the elegant logic behind them, the way physical laws revealed themselves through numerical relationships. The judges, 3 middle school science teachers and a retired engineer, approached Marcus's station with the kind of serious attention that made Sarah's chest tighten with anticipation. They asked probing questions about his methodology, challenged his calculations, and tested his understanding of the principles he had applied. Marcus responded with confidence, but not arrogance, showing his work and acknowledging the limitations of his model with scientific honesty. "Young man," the retired engineer said, examining the turbine's construction with obvious appreciation, "this is graduate-level systems thinking applied to a practical engineering problem. Have you considered entering the regional science competition?" Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message just as Marcus beamed with pride at the compliment. The message was from Margaret Chen. "Board meeting emergency session called for Monday morning. Your proposal is being fast-tracked for implementation. Blackwell has submitted his resignation an hour ago." Sarah stared at the screen, processing the implications of Margaret's words. Blackwell had resigned. The man who had seemed untouchable, who had wielded corporate power like a weapon for over a decade, had been brought down by a custodian with a borrowed calculator and 5 years of suppressed brilliance. "Mom, is everything okay?" Marcus's voice pulled her back to the present moment. "Everything is perfect, mijo. I just got some good news from work." "Did you win your debate?" Sarah smiled, slipping her phone back into her purse. "I think we all won today." The science fair judging concluded an hour later with Marcus earning second place in the engineering category and an invitation to represent his school at the district competition. As they walked to the car through the crisp October evening, Emma chattering excitedly about her friend's volcano demonstration and Marcus still glowing from his success, Sarah felt a strange lightness in her chest, the unfamiliar sensation of breathing without the constant weight of suppressed potential. "Mom," Emma said from the back seat as they drove home, "are you going to keep cleaning offices now that everyone knows you're really smart?" The question hung in the air like a bridge between the woman Sarah had been forced to become and the woman she might yet choose to be. Survival, the job she needed to keep, the bills she had to pay.
The limited options available to a single mother with brilliant credentials but no professional network.
I don't know yet, sweetheart. Sometimes life gives us chances to make different choices than we thought were possible. That weekend, Sarah's phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, headhunters, and academic colleagues who had somehow heard about the confrontation at Meridian Industries. The story had leaked, probably through Jerome or Rita or one of the dozen support staff who had witnessed Blackwell's intellectual dismantling and had spread through Seattle's business community like wildfire. By Monday morning, 3 different news outlets had contacted her for interviews, 2 universities had extended teaching offers, and a prominent consulting firm had expressed interest in her expertise in corporate psychology and systems analysis. The invisible woman had become spectacularly visible, and the attention felt both validating and overwhelming. The emergency board meeting at Meridian Industries convened at 9 a.m. in the same conference room where Sarah had been challenged to prove her worth 5 days earlier. But the dynamics had shifted completely. She entered through the main lobby, rather than the service entrance, wearing a tailored navy suit that Margaret Chen had helped her select from Nordstrom's professional women's department. Jerome smiled and nodded as she passed, his expression conveying volumes about respect, vindication, and the quiet satisfaction of watching justice prevail. The boardroom was packed with the same executives who had witnessed her debate with Blackwell, but their body language had transformed entirely. Where once they had regarded her with dismissive curiosity, now they watched her with the careful attention reserved for someone whose opinion actually mattered. Margaret Chen called the meeting to order and immediately yielded the floor to Richard Steinberg, the board's chairman, a man in his 70s with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who had seen enough corporate battles to appreciate genuine competence when he encountered it. "Ms. Martinez," Steinberg began, his voice carrying the authority of decades in business leadership. "I've spent the weekend reviewing your alternative proposal and consulting with independent analysts about its feasibility. I'm pleased to report that 3 separate consulting firms have confirmed your projections and methodology." Sarah felt a rush of vindication, mixed with something more complex, the recognition that her 5 years of careful observation and analysis had been validated by people whose expertise commanded respect in rooms like this. "Furthermore," Steinberg continued, "the board has voted unanimously to implement your cost reduction plan rather than the workforce reductions originally proposed. We estimate that your approach will save the company approximately $14.8 million in the first year, while preserving jobs and benefits for our entire workforce." The applause that followed was genuine and sustained, a room full of executives acknowledging that their assumptions about intelligence, education, and professional worth had been fundamentally challenged and found wanting. "But we have a problem," Steinberg said, as the applause died down. "Your proposal requires someone with your unique combination of mathematical expertise and institutional knowledge to oversee its implementation. We'd like to offer you a position as Director of Operational Analysis, with a salary and benefits package commensurate with your qualifications and the value you bring to this organization." Sarah felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders like a cloak that had always belonged to her but had somehow been misplaced for 5 years. This was the recognition she had dreamed of, the opportunity to use her intelligence in service of something larger than mere survival. "What about my custodial position?" she asked. "What about it?" Steinberg looked genuinely confused. "The people I work with, Rita, Jerome, the other maintenance staff, they're good people doing important work that keeps this company functioning. If I accept your offer, I want assurances that they'll be treated with the respect and dignity they deserve."
The request seemed to surprise several board members, but Steinberg nodded approvingly. Ms. Martinez, anyone who would use their newfound influence to advocate for others rather than simply advance their own interests is exactly the kind of person we need in leadership. Consider those assurances given. The meeting continued for another hour, working through details of Sarah's transition from custodian to executive, the timeline for implementing her cost-saving measures, and the structural changes needed to prevent the kind of intellectual blindness that had nearly led to Blackwell's destructive proposal. As the meeting adjourned, Margaret Chen approached Sarah with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal warmth. "How does it feel?" Margaret asked, "going from invisible to indispensable in the space of a week?" Sarah considered the question while gathering her materials that now included organizational charts, budget projections, and implementation timelines, rather than cleaning supplies and maintenance schedules. "Honestly, it feels like I've been holding my breath for 5 years and can finally exhale. Any regrets about the path it took to get here?" Sarah thought about Blackwell's humiliation, the public nature of his defeat, the way his arrogance had ultimately engineered his own downfall. She felt no satisfaction in his suffering, but no guilt either. Sometimes systems changed only when their failures became too obvious to ignore. "None," she said. "Sometimes the truth requires dramatic presentation to be heard." That afternoon, Sarah returned to Roosevelt Elementary to pick up her children, but this time she wasn't rushing from one job to another. For the first time in 5 years, she had time. Time to listen to Emma's detailed description of her art class. Time to help Marcus refine his science fair presentation for the district competition. Time to be present in the small moments that comprise the daily miracle of watching her children grow into their own brilliant selves. As they drove home through Seattle's afternoon traffic, Sarah's phone buzzed with another call from a headhunter, another interview request, another opportunity that had materialized from the wreckage of her confrontation with Blackwell. But she let it go to voicemail. There would be time for all of that tomorrow. Today, she wanted to savor the feeling of breathing freely, of being seen fully, of existing in the world as all the brilliant, complicated, multifaceted woman she had always been. The invisible woman had become visible at last, and the view from here was extraordinary. 3 months later. The conference room on the 42nd floor of Meridian Industries bore little resemblance to the arena where Sarah Martinez had once dismantled a CEO's intellectual arrogance. Gone were the theatrical power dynamics and hierarchical positioning that had once defined corporate meetings in this space. Instead, the room buzzed with collaborative energy as Sarah facilitated her weekly cross-departmental efficiency review, a gathering that brought together executives, middle managers, and frontline employees to identify systemic improvements from multiple perspectives. "Maria, what patterns are you seeing in customer service response times since we implemented the new scheduling system?" Sarah asked, turning to Maria Santos, a customer service representative who had been cleaning offices alongside Sarah just 3 months earlier. Maria straightened in her chair, still adjusting to being asked for her professional opinion in a room full of executives. "Response times have improved by about 30%, but seeing bottlenecks when technical issues require escalation to IT, the handoff process creates delays that frustrate customers." Sarah nodded, making notes on her tablet. "Jerome, from your security perspective, how often are you seeing IT personnel working overtime to handle these escalations?" Jerome Williams, who had been promoted from security guard to facilities operations coordinator, consulted his own notes. "Nearly every day, especially during peak customer service hours. The IT folks are getting burned out, and I've noticed more resignations in that department than usual." The conversation that followed exemplified Sarah's revolutionary approach to corporate problem-solving.
gathering input from people at every level of the organization, treating janitors' observations as seriously as executives' analyses, and recognizing that the people closest to problems often had the clearest insights into solutions. Dr. Sarah Martinez, she had reclaimed her title along with her professional identity, had spent her first 3 months as Director of Operational Analysis implementing changes that saved Meridian Industries over $12 million, while simultaneously improving employee satisfaction, customer service ratings, and workplace efficiency. Her success had attracted attention from business schools, consulting firms, and companies across multiple industries, eager to understand how mathematical modeling could be combined with ground-level observation to transform organizational culture. Dr. Martinez, Margaret Chen said as the meeting concluded, "I have someone I'd like you to meet. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell from the University of Washington is here for the consultant interview." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Dr. Hartwell had been her dissertation advisor at MIT, the mentor who had guided her through her graduate research and had periodically reached out over the years, never understanding why Sarah had seemingly vanished from academia 10 years ago. The reunion would be both validating and potentially painful, a confrontation with the road not taken, the life that circumstances had forced her to abandon. Dr. Hartwell waited in Sarah's office, a corner space with windows overlooking Elliott Bay and walls lined with whiteboards covered in equations, organizational charts, and theoretical models that bridged economics, psychology, and systems theory. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, and her expression when she saw Sarah was a mixture of recognition, confusion, and something that might have been relief. "Sarah," Dr. Hartwell said, rising from her chair, with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades commanding lecture halls. "When I heard that Meridian Industries had hired a Dr. Sarah Martinez as Director of Operational Analysis, I wondered if it could possibly be you. But then I researched your recent work and thought, no, this can't be the same brilliant student who vanished from academia 10 years ago. Yet here you are." Sarah gestured for her mentor to sit, then settled behind her desk with the calm composure she had developed through months of navigating corporate politics and academic skepticism. "Here I am, though the path from there to here wasn't exactly what either of us might have expected." Dr. Hartwell studied Sarah with the penetrating attention of someone accustomed to evaluating intellectual development and professional trajectory. "I've read about your work here. The cost-saving initiatives, the organizational restructuring, the integration of mathematical modeling with anthropological observation, it's groundbreaking research disguised as business consulting."
"Is that what it is?" Sarah asked with a slight smile. "I thought I was just trying to help a company save money while treating its employees like human beings." "Don't minimize what you've accomplished. The papers you could publish based on this work would revolutionize organizational psychology and applied economics. The question is, why aren't you publishing them?" The question hung between them like a bridge across a decade of separation, misunderstanding, and missed opportunities. Sarah looked out her window at the Seattle skyline, thinking about the choices that had led her to this moment. The pregnancy that had derailed her academic trajectory, the financial pressures that had forced her into survival mode, the years of intellectual hibernation that had preceded this unexpected renaissance. "Because I'm not sure I want to be an academic anymore," Sarah said finally. "For 10 years, I thought I had been exiled from the life of the mind. But it turned out I was just applying it differently, to midnight feedings and math homework and the organizational dynamics of custodial crews. The intellectual work never stopped. It just became invisible to people who could only recognize intelligence in traditional academic formats." Dr. Hartwell leaned forward, her expression intense with the focus of someone pursuing an important line of inquiry. "But surely you miss the research environment, the collaborative exchange of ideas, the satisfaction of advancing human knowledge." Sarah gestured toward her whiteboards, covered with collaborative work from her cross-departmental teams. "I'm advancing human knowledge every day.
I'm just doing it in a corporate setting rather than an academic one, and the knowledge I'm advancing has immediate applications that improve people's lives. The conversation continued for over an hour, ranging across topics from theoretical economics to practical management philosophy to the complex interplay between intellectual fulfillment and social responsibility. Dr. Hartwell had come expecting to recruit a former student back into academia. Instead, she found herself reconsidering her own assumptions about where important intellectual work could happen and how it could be measured. 6 months later, Marcus stood at the front of the district science fair auditorium, his voice carrying clearly as he explained his renewable energy project to a panel of judges that included 2 university professors and an engineer from Boeing. At 13, he had grown 3 inches and gained the confident bearing of someone who had learned that intelligence combined with hard work could overcome almost any obstacle. The efficiency improvements I've demonstrated here could theoretically be scaled up for commercial wind farms, but the real innovation is in the adaptive blade technology that responds to changing wind conditions in real time. Marcus watched from the audience, her heart swelling with the kind of pride that had nothing to do with her own accomplishments and everything to do with witnessing her son become the person he was meant to be. Beside her sat Emma, now 10, and working on her own science project about the mathematics of music theory, and Dr. Hartwell, who had become a frequent visitor since Sarah had agreed to guest lecture in her organizational psychology courses. "He's going to win," Dr. Hartwell whispered, "and not just because of the technical innovation. He has that rare combination of intellectual rigor and practical application that produces genuine breakthroughs." "He gets that from his mother," Sarah replied, but her attention was focused on Marcus as he fielded questions from the judges with the same calm competence she had once brought to her own doctoral defense. The similarities between mother and son were striking, the way they both used mathematical reasoning to solve practical problems, their shared ability to explain complex concepts in accessible terms, and their obvious passion for understanding how systems worked and how they could be improved. But Marcus was growing up in a world where his intelligence was recognized and celebrated, where it improved other people's lives and was highly valued. He understood that work that looked frivolous to one might be profoundly meaningful to another. He also knew that his mother had made possible the kind of life where he gave his intellectual curiosities and passions free rein in novel settings in ways that could potentially improve the lives of millions, while also feeling like he was living a life that felt right to him.
Recognized and nurtured from the beginning, where his potential was visible to everyone who met him rather than hidden behind circumstances and prejudice. When Marcus was announced as the first-place winner in the engineering category and invited to compete at the state level, Sarah felt a surge of emotion that surprised her with its intensity. This was what success looked like, not the corporate recognition or academic validation she had recently gained, but the knowledge that her children were growing up confident in their abilities and unlimited in their aspirations. 1 year later. The auditorium at the University of Washington was packed with an audience that included business leaders, academics, policymakers, and a surprising number of custodial workers, security guards, and administrative assistants who had heard about Dr. Sarah Martinez's keynote address on hidden intelligence, recognizing brilliance in unexpected places. Sarah stood at the podium, looking out at faces that represented every level of organizational hierarchy and educational background. Her opening slides showed 2 photographs, one of her in her custodial uniform cleaning the Meridian Industries boardroom, and another of her in her current role facilitating a strategy meeting with the same executives who had once looked through her as if she were invisible. "Intelligence," she began, her voice carrying easily through the large space, "is not a rare commodity confined to people with advanced degrees from prestigious universities. Intelligence is everywhere, in the custodian who notices patterns in waste generation that reveal inefficiencies in supply chain management, in the security guard who understands traffic flow better than most urban planners,
in the administrative assistant who can predict organizational bottlenecks based on email patterns and meeting schedules. The audience listened with rapt attention of people hearing familiar truths expressed for the first time in academic language. Sarah's presentation wove together mathematical models, case studies from Meridian Industries, and broader theories about how organizations could tap into the collective intelligence of their entire workforce, rather than limiting decision-making to traditional leadership hierarchies. The question isn't whether hidden intelligence exists in your organization, Sarah continued, clicking to a slide showing productivity improvements at companies that had implemented her collaborative management approaches. The question is whether you're creating systems that recognize and utilize that intelligence, or whether you're allowing brilliant insights to die in silence because they come from people whose job titles don't command respect. During the question and answer session that followed, Sarah fielded inquiries that ranged from technical implementation details to philosophical questions about educational inequality and social mobility. A graduate student asked about the psychological impact of intellectual recognition on workers who had been previously invisible. A CEO wanted to know how to identify hidden talent in his own organization. A retired professor questioned whether Sarah's approach could be scaled to larger corporate structures. Each question revealed the breadth of interest in Sarah's work, which had evolved far beyond cost-saving measures at a single company into a comprehensive framework for organizational transformation. She had published 3 papers in peer-reviewed journals, consulted with dozens of companies, and developed training programs that were being implemented across multiple industries. But perhaps most importantly, she had proven that intellectual contributions could come from anyone, anywhere, regardless of their formal credentials or current job responsibilities. 2 years later, Emma Martinez, now 12 and already showing signs of her mother's mathematical brilliance, stood in the kitchen of their new house in the Queen Anne neighborhood, helping Sarah prepare dinner while Marcus practiced his violin in the living room. The house was modest but comfortable, 3 bedrooms, a dedicated office for Sarah's consulting work, and a large kitchen table where homework and theoretical discussions happened in equal measure. "Mom," Emma said, carefully measuring ingredients for the complicated Indian curry recipe Sarah was teaching her, "my teacher says you're famous now. Is that true?"
Sarah smiled while stirring onions in the large cast-iron pan that had been a housewarming gift from Margaret Chen. Fame was a relative concept, she had learned. Within certain circles, organizational psychology, applied economics, progressive management theory, she had indeed become well known. Her TED Talk had been viewed over 2 million times. Her consulting firm had a waiting list of Fortune 500 companies, and business schools were adding her case studies to their curricula. "I suppose I'm known in some places," Sarah said. "But fame isn't really the point, Mija. The point is using whatever abilities you have to make things better for other people." Emma nodded seriously, adding spices to the pan with the careful precision she applied to everything from math problems to art projects. "Like how you helped all those people keep their jobs?" "Exactly like that." The conversation was interrupted by Marcus calling from the living room where he was taking a break from violin practice to work on calculus problems that his high school math teacher had given him as enrichment work. "Mom, can you help me with this integral? I think I understand the substitution method, but I'm getting confused about the limits of integration." Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and walked into the living room, where Marcus had spread his homework across the coffee table alongside sheet music for the Bach piece he was preparing for his youth orchestra audition. At 15, he had grown tall and lean, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's analytical mind. He had been accepted to the University of Washington's early enrollment program, taking advanced mathematics and physics courses while still completing his high school requirements. "Show me what you've tried so far," Sarah said, settling beside him on the couch. Marcus walked her through his work, his explanation revealing both his mathematical intuition and the gaps in his understanding that were perfectly normal for someone his age tackling college-level calculus. Sarah guided him toward the solution with questions rather than direct instruction, helping him discover the logical progression that would lead to the correct answer. "Oh, I see," Marcus exclaimed as the solution crystallized. "When you change the variable, you have to change the limits too. The boundaries of integration transform along with the function." Exactly. The mathematics is always internally consistent. You just have to follow the logic all the way through. These moments of intellectual connection with her children felt like the deepest validation of the path Sarah had chosen. Emma and Marcus were growing up in a household where curiosity was encouraged, where intelligence was celebrated regardless of its form, and where they understood that their mother's journey from custodian to consultant was not a transformation, but of recognition, the world finally seeing what had always been there. 3 years later, the boardroom at Meridian Industries had been renamed the Sarah Martinez Collaborative Conference Center, a designation that Sarah made slightly uncomfortable, but that the board had insisted upon over her objections. The room was now used primarily for cross-departmental meetings, employee recognition ceremonies, and the monthly innovation sessions where workers from every level of the organization could propose improvements to company operations. Sarah stood at the head of the table, facilitating a discussion between the executive team and a group of maintenance workers who had developed a revolutionary approach to predictive equipment maintenance using pattern recognition and basic statistical analysis. The conversation exemplified everything Sarah had been working toward: intelligence flowing upward through organizational hierarchies, practical insights being valued alongside theoretical knowledge, and workers being recognized as thinking human beings rather than interchangeable components. Carlos, who had once been as invisible to executives as Sarah herself, now spoke with the confidence of someone whose insights were valued and respected. The failures weren't random like we thought. They followed a 28-day cycle that corresponded to the cleaning schedule for the air filtration systems. When we adjusted the cleaning frequency based on actual usage patterns rather than the manufacturer's generic recommendations, failure rates dropped by 67%. Margaret Chen, now the company's CEO following a restructuring that had elevated collaborative leaders over traditional corporate climbers, leaned forward with obvious interest. What was the cost impact of this change? Maintenance costs decreased by about $40,000 annually, Carlos replied, consulting notes he had written in the careful handwriting of someone unaccustomed to presenting to executives. But the bigger savings came from avoiding system downtime. We estimate that prevented productivity losses worth approximately $200,000 per year. Sarah felt the familiar warmth of witnessing intelligence being recognized and rewarded regardless of its source. Carlos's insight was exactly the kind of ground-level observation that traditional corporate structures systematically ignored, treating maintenance workers as manual laborers rather than skilled analysts capable of understanding complex systems. Carlos, have you considered presenting this methodology at the National Facilities Management Conference? Sarah asked. Your approach could revolutionize predictive maintenance across multiple industries. The suggestion clearly surprised Carlos, who still struggled to see himself as someone whose ideas might have value beyond the walls of Meridian Industries. But Sarah had learned that one of the most important aspects of recognizing hidden intelligence was helping people recognize it in themselves. I don't know if I'm qualified for something like that, Carlos said. You developed a statistically sound methodology that solved a complex problem and generated measurable results. That makes you eminently qualified. After the meeting concluded, Sarah walked through the building that had once been her workplace in a very different capacity. The changes were visible everywhere, in the way executives greeted custodial workers by name, in the suggestion boxes that were actually read and acted upon, in the cross-training programs that allowed ambitious employees to develop new skills regardless of their starting position. But perhaps most importantly, the changes were visible in the way people carried themselves. Workers who had once felt invisible now walked with the bearing of people whose contributions mattered. Managers who had once relied solely on hierarchical authority now sought input from their teams before making decisions.
The entire organizational culture had shifted from one that hoarded intelligence in executive suites to one that cultivated it throughout every department and division. 5 years later, the graduation ceremony at the University of Washington was a sea of caps and gowns under the late spring sunshine. Families crowded into stadium seating to witness their children receive degrees that represented years of dedication and sacrifice. Sarah sat in the guest section, watching as Emma Martinez, now 17, and graduating summa cum laude with a double major in mathematics and economics, walked across the stage to receive her bachelor's degree. Emma had followed an accelerated academic path similar to her mother's, but without the financial constraints and social barriers that had complicated Sarah's journey. She had been recognized as exceptional from an early age, had received scholarships and research opportunities, and was already accepted to MIT's graduate program in applied mathematics with full funding and a research assistantship. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the announcer called over the public address system, receiving an honorary doctorate in organizational psychology for her groundbreaking research on hidden intelligence in corporate environments and for her contributions to progressive management theory. Sarah rose from her seat and walked toward the stage, still somewhat amazed by the path that had led from that confrontation in the Meridian Industries boardroom to this moment of academic recognition. The honorary doctorate was awarded for work that had grown far beyond
cost-saving measures at a single company into a comprehensive framework for organizational transformation that was being implemented across multiple industries and taught in business schools worldwide. As she accepted the diploma and shook hands with the university president, Sarah looked out at the audience and spotted familiar faces. Marcus, now a sophomore at MIT studying renewable energy engineering, Dr. Hartwell, beaming with the pride of a mentor whose student had exceeded all expectations, Margaret Chen, Jerome Williams, Rita Gonzalez, and dozens of other Meridian Industries employees who had become part of her extended professional family. But it was Emma's face that drew her attention, her daughter's expression combining pride, admiration, and something deeper that looked like understanding. Emma had grown up watching her mother navigate the complex intersection of intellectual brilliance and social invisibility, had witnessed the slow process of recognition and validation, and had learned that intelligence without opportunity was merely potential waiting to be unleashed. 7 years later, the small conference room at the Martinez Consulting Group buzzed with collaborative energy as Sarah facilitated a strategy session with her team of associates, a group that included former custodians, retired executives, recent PhD graduates, and experienced consultants who had been drawn to her revolutionary approach to organizational development. The company Sarah had founded 3 years earlier specialized in helping organizations identify and utilize hidden intelligence throughout their workforce. Their client list included Fortune 500 companies, nonprofit organizations, government agencies, and educational institutions that were all working to break down the barriers that prevented talented people from contributing their full capabilities. The textile manufacturing company in North Carolina is showing remarkable results, reported Dr. James Morrison, the former Meridian Industries VP who had become one of Sarah's closest collaborators after witnessing her transformation of corporate culture. Productivity is up 18% since they implemented the collaborative management structure, and employee satisfaction scores have reached historic highs. Sarah nodded while reviewing the quarterly reports spread across the conference table. Each client represented a different challenge. Some were traditional corporations struggling to adapt to changing workforce expectations. Others were startups trying to build inclusive cultures from the ground up. And still others were established institutions working to eliminate systemic barriers to advancement. "What about the resistance from middle management?" Sarah asked. "That's usually where these initiatives face the strongest opposition." "Initially significant," James admitted. Middle managers felt threatened by the flattening of hierarchical decision-making, but once they realized that collaborative leadership actually made their jobs easier and more fulfilling, most became strong advocates for the changes. The conversation continued for another hour, covering implementation strategies, measurement methodologies, and the growing body of research that supported Sarah's theoretical framework. Her work had evolved into a comprehensive approach that combined mathematical modeling with anthropological observation, systems thinking with psychological insight, and practical business solutions with social justice advocacy. 10 years later, Emma Martinez, now Dr. Emma Martinez, with a PhD in applied mathematics from MIT and a postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford, stood at the podium of the International Conference on Organizational Psychology, delivering a keynote address on intergenerational intelligence, how recognition patterns shape intellectual development. In the audience, Sarah watched her daughter present research that built upon and extended the work Sarah had pioneered, taking it in directions that Sarah herself might never have imagined. Emma's presentation explored how children who grew up in households where intelligence was recognized and valued, regardless of its form or source, developed different cognitive patterns
than those raised in environments where intellectual contribution was limited to traditional academic or professional channels. The data suggests, Emma said, clicking to a slide showing brain scan comparisons, the children who witnessed their parents' intelligence being recognized after a period of invisibility show enhanced neural plasticity and increased willingness to take intellectual risks. They learn that intelligence is not a fixed trait, but a dynamic capability that can emerge and be developed under the right circumstances. Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions as she listened to her daughter present work that was both deeply personal and rigorously scientific. Emma's research was exploring the neurological and psychological mechanisms behind the very transformation that Sarah had experienced, the process by which hidden intelligence could emerge when barriers to recognition were removed. But beyond the professional validation, Sarah felt something deeper. The satisfaction of knowing that her journey from invisible custodian to recognized expert had created ripple effects that would continue long after her own career ended. Emma and Marcus had both grown up understanding that intelligence was everywhere, that brilliance could be found in unexpected places, and that their job was to help create systems that recognized and nurtured human potential regardless of its packaging. 15 years later, Marcus Martinez stood in his laboratory at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, surrounded by prototypes of the revolutionary wind turbine technology he had developed based on principles he first explored in a middle school science fair project. At 30, he had become one of the leading researchers in renewable energy engineering, holding 17 patents and leading a team of scientists working to solve the global climate crisis through innovative technology. The turbine design that had earned him second place in that long-ago science fair had evolved into a commercial product that was now generating clean energy in wind farms across 3 continents. But more importantly, Marcus had developed a collaborative research methodology that involved communities in the design and implementation of renewable energy projects, ensuring that technological solutions addressed real-world needs and local concerns. Dr. Martinez, his research assistant called from across the lab, the delegation from Bangladesh is here for the technology transfer meeting. Marcus smiled as he walked toward the conference room where representatives from rural Bangladesh communities were waiting to learn about wind technology that could bring electricity to villages that had never been connected to power grids. The meeting represented everything his mother had taught him about the intersection of intelligence, opportunity, and social responsibility, using technical expertise to solve practical problems that improved people's lives. The delegation included engineers, community leaders, and farmers who would be responsible for maintaining the turbines once they were installed. Marcus had learned from his mother's example that the most effective solutions came from collaborative efforts that valued multiple types of expertise and ensured that local knowledge was incorporated into technical designs. As he began the presentation,
Marcus thought about the path that had led from his childhood science fair to this moment, a journey shaped by a mother who had shown him that intelligence without application was meaningless, that recognition without responsibility was hollow, and that the greatest achievements came from using whatever gifts you possessed to lift others up alongside yourself. 20 years later, the auditorium at Seattle Central Community College was packed with an audience that spanned every demographic and economic background. Students pursuing associate's degrees, working parents trying to advance their careers, recent immigrants building new lives, and older adults exploring interests they had never had time to pursue. Sarah Martinez, now 64 and officially retired from consulting but still actively involved in educational advocacy, stood at the podium delivering the keynote address for the college's graduation ceremony.
Intelligence, she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades proving that brilliance could not be contained by circumstances, is not a privilege reserved for the fortunate few. It is not determined by your bank account, your job title, or the prestige of your educational credentials. Intelligence is the birthright of every human being, and the tragedy of our society is how often we allow that intelligence to remain hidden and unrecognized. The audience, many of whom were experiencing their first taste of educational achievement after years or decades of having their potential overlooked, listened with the intense attention of people hearing their own stories reflected in academic language. Some of you are here because life gave you a second chance to pursue education. Others are here because you finally found an institution that recognized intelligence in forms that traditional universities overlooked. All of you are here because you refuse to accept other people's limitations on your potential. Sarah's speech wove together personal narrative, social analysis, and practical advice, drawing on 2 decades of research and consulting to offer a framework for recognizing and developing intelligence in all its forms. She spoke about the custodian who had noticed patterns in corporate waste streams that revealed supply chain inefficiencies, about the security guard who had developed crowd management theories that were now taught in police academies, about the administrative assistant whose scheduling algorithms had revolutionized project management across multiple industries. The question is not whether you are intelligent enough to succeed. The question is whether you will create opportunities for others to recognize and develop their own hidden brilliance. Will you be the person who sees potential where others see only limitations? Will you be the voice that says your ideas matter? Your observations have value. Your intelligence deserves recognition. As the graduates walked across the stage to receive their diplomas, Sarah felt the familiar warmth of witnessing human potential being acknowledged and celebrated. These students, many of them older than traditional college graduates, many juggling work and family responsibilities, many pursuing education as a path out of economic hardship, represented everything Sarah had spent her career advocating for. In the audience, she spotted familiar faces from throughout her journey. Emma was there with her own teenage children, continuing the family tradition of academic excellence while also inheriting Sarah's commitment to social justice. Marcus had brought his research team, showing them how educational institutions could serve as catalysts for community transformation. Margaret Chen, now retired but still active in corporate governance, sat alongside Jerome Williams, who had become a nationally recognized expert on workplace equity after completing his business degree at age 58. But perhaps most meaningful were the faces Sarah didn't recognize. Former students of students, employees of companies that had implemented her methodologies, children of workers whose careers had been transformed by recognition of their hidden intelligence. The ripple effects of that long-ago confrontation in the Meridian Industries boardroom had spread far beyond anything Sarah could have imagined, creating waves of change that would continue long after she was gone. 25 years later.
Dr. Emma Martinez, now 52, and the director of the Martinez Institute for Organizational Intelligence at the University of Washington, stood before a packed auditorium of graduate students, business leaders, and policymakers from around the world. The institute, founded with the proceeds from Sarah's consulting firm and now endowed by companies that had been transformed by her methodologies, had become the leading research center for studying hidden intelligence in organizational settings. "My mother," she began, clicking to a slide showing the famous photograph of Sarah in her custodial uniform alongside an image of her receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her contributions to workplace equity, used to say that intelligence was like water. It takes the shape of whatever container it's placed in, but its essential nature never changes. The audience, which included CEOs who had implemented collaborative management structures, researchers studying cognitive diversity, and activists working to eliminate educational barriers, listened with the reverence accorded to foundational thinkers whose ideas had shaped entire fields of study. For 25 years, the Martinez Institute has been working to expand the containers we use to recognize and measure intelligence. We've developed assessment tools that value practical wisdom alongside theoretical knowledge, created management structures that harness collective intelligence rather than individual brilliance, and demonstrated that the most innovative solutions emerge when we stop limiting contributions to traditional credentialed experts. Emma's presentation summarized 2.5 decades of research that had fundamentally altered how organizations thought about talent identification, employee development, and collaborative problem-solving. The Institute's methodologies were now taught in business schools worldwide, implemented by multinational corporations, and used by government agencies working to tap into the full intellectual potential of their workforces. But perhaps my mother's greatest insight, Emma continued, her voice carrying the warmth of personal memory alongside professional authority, was that recognition is not just about identifying hidden intelligence. It's about creating systems that allow that intelligence to flourish and contribute to collective human welfare. As Emma spoke, the audience included people whose lives had been directly touched by Sarah's work and ideas. Former custodians who had become corporate consultants, security guards who had earned advanced degrees, administrative assistants who had developed innovative management theories, and countless others who had discovered that their intelligence was not only valid, but valuable. The presentation concluded with Emma announcing the establishment of the Sarah Martinez Fellowship, a program that would provide full funding for PhD students from non-traditional backgrounds to pursue research in organizational psychology, applied economics, and social justice advocacy. Intelligence, Emma said, in closing, echoing her mother's favorite theme, is everywhere. Our job is to make sure it's seen, heard, valued, and given the opportunity to change the world. As the applause died down and the audience began filing out of the auditorium, Emma noticed an older woman in the back row who had remained seated, tears streaming down her face. Emma approached her with the gentle concern that her mother had always shown for people whose emotions revealed deep personal connections to the work. "Are you all right?" Emma asked. The woman looked up with eyes that held both pain and profound gratitude. 30 years ago, I was a night shift janitor at a tech company in Silicon Valley. I had ideas about improving their software development process, but when I tried to share them, they laughed at me, said I should stick to emptying trash cans and leave the thinking to people with computer science degrees. She paused, composing herself before continuing. I never pursued those ideas. I was too ashamed, too convinced that maybe they were right about my limitations. But listening to your mother's story, seeing what she accomplished, it makes me wonder what might have been different if I had believed in myself, the way she learned to believe in herself. Emma felt the weight of her mother's legacy settling on her shoulders, not just the academic recognition or the institutional changes, but the individual lives that had been touched by the simple, revolutionary idea that intelligence was not the exclusive property of the traditionally educated. "It's never too late," Emma said gently. "Those ideas you had 30 years ago, they're still yours. The world still needs them." The woman smiled through her tears. "Maybe it's time I finally shared them." As Emma watched the woman walk away with her shoulders straighter and her step more confident, she understood that this was her mother's true legacy, not the awards or the accolades or the institutional changes, but the countless moments when someone who had been invisible finally saw themselves as worthy of being heard. The custodian who had challenged a CEO 25 years earlier had set in motion a revolution that was still unfolding, one recognition at a time, one conversation at a time, one life at a time. And somewhere in Seattle, in a small apartment where a single mother was helping her children with homework while dreaming of possibilities beyond her current circumstances, the next chapter of that revolution was waiting to be written. Sarah Martinez had proven that intelligence could not be hidden forever. Her daughter Emma was ensuring that it would never have to be hidden again. The silence had been broken, the invisible had become visible, and the world would never be the same.